Russian troops have increased shelling of Ukraine's eastern regions outside the main front line in the Donbas industrial area, according to officials from Zaporizhia and Sumy regions. Mikhailo Podolyak, a senior advisor to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, has urged Kyiv's allies to think faster about stepping up their military support, a day after they failed to agree on sending battle tanks Kyiv says it needs. Germany's new defense minister Boris Pistorius plans to visit Ukraine soon as Berlin faces pressure to allow the shipment of German-made tanks to Ukraine. Senior U.S. officials are advising Ukraine to hold off on launching a major offensive against Russian forces until the latest supply of U.S. weaponry is in place and training has been provided, a senior Biden administration official said. The U.S. will impose additional sanctions next week against Russian private military company, the Wagner Group, which U.S. officials say has been helping Russia's military in the Ukraine war, the White House said. The head of Wagner published a letter to the White House asking what crime his company was accused of. Germany is ready to authorize Poland to send German-made Leopard tanks to Ukraine to help Kyiv fight the Russian invasion if Warsaw makes such a request, Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock has said. Poland has announced it is ready to deliver 14 Leopard tanks to Kyiv, but Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki said on Sunday he was waiting for a clear statement from Berlin whether countries that have the Leopards can transfer them to Ukraine. Ukrainian main military intelligence directorate representative Andriy Yusov stated that there is currently no threat of a Russian offensive operation from Belarus and that the GUR has not observed a grouping and readiness of Russian forces in Belarus that would allow for such an operation. Finland freezes Russian assets worth €187 million. Finland's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The frozen Russian assets include real estate, airplanes, yachts, cars, equities, etc. Russian State Duma Chairman Vyacheslav Volodin made incredible threats of nuclear escalation as part of an ongoing information operation aimed at deterring the Western provision of further military aid to Ukraine. Russia is very unlikely to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine and extraordinarily unlikely to use them against the West. Russian forces continued limited counterattacks to regain lost positions along the Svatov-Kreminna line on January 22. Russian sources claimed that Ukrainian forces struck an industrial facility in Kadiivka, Luhansk Oblast, with HIMARS rockets. Wagner financier Yevgeny Prigozhin's star has begun to set after months of apparent rise following his failure to make good on promises of capturing Bakhmut with his own forces. Russian President Vladimir Putin had likely turned to Prigozhin and Prigozhin's reported ally, Army General Sergei Surovikin, to continue efforts to gain ground and break the will of Ukraine and its Western backers to continue the war after the conventional Russian military had culminated and, indeed, suffered disastrous setbacks. The Russian Ministry of Defense and General Staff, headed by Sergei Shoigu and Army General Valery Gerasimov respectively, had turned their attention to mobilizing Russian reservists and conscripts and setting conditions for improved performance by the conventional Russian military, but they had little hope of achieving anything decisive in the fall and early winter of 2022. Putin apparently decided to give Prigozhin and Surovikin a chance to show what they could do with mobilized prisoners, on the one hand, and a brutal air campaign targeting Ukrainian civilian infrastructure on the other. Both efforts failed, as Prigozhin's attempts to seize Bakhmut culminated and Surovikin's air campaign accomplished little more than inflicting suffering on Ukrainian civilians while expending most of Russia's remaining stocks of precision missiles. Prigozhin seems to have decided in this period that his star really was on the ascendant and that he could challenge Gerasimov and even Shoigu for preeminence in Russian military affairs. Those hopes now seem to have been delusional. Putin appears to have decided to turn away from relying on Prigozhin and his irregular forces and to put his trust instead in Gerasimov, Shoigu, and the conventional Russian military once more. Ukrainian intelligence and select Kremlin officials have also reported that Putin is preparing to launch a second wave of reserve mobilization to expand the Russian armed forces, and the Russian MOD has been attempting to improve the professionalism of its conventional forces and to test the effectiveness of its chains of command. Such reforms and appointments mark a significant inflection in the Kremlin's efforts to reconstitute its conventional military and a de-emphasis of short-term mitigation efforts such as the use of irregular formations on the front lines. Putin's decision to focus and rely on conventional Russian forces is marginalizing the Wagner Group and the Siloviki faction that nevertheless continues to contribute to Russian war efforts in Ukraine. The Siloviki faction is a small group of Russian businessmen and leaders with meaningful power bases and parallel military companies, and includes individuals such as Prigozhin. Putin's resubordinating to Gerasimov, the commander of the aerospace forces, Surovikin, whose October 8 appointment received widespread support from the Siloviki faction, reversed a months-long trend of Putin's efforts to placate the Siloviki. Ukrainian intelligence had previously reported that Prigozhin formed an alliance with Surovikin that enabled Wagner Group to receive heavy weapons from the Russian armed forces and that the two together rivaled Shoigu. Putin is also attempting to rebuild the Russian MOD's authority and reputation, both of which had been badly damaged by failures in 2022 and heavily attacked by the Siloviki faction for many months. Putin's turnabout became most evident when he pointedly did not credit Prigozhin or his Wagner forces for the capture of Soledar during a federal TV interview on January 15. Putin likely turned to Prigozhin's irregular forces to get through the period following the Russian conventional military's culmination after the reckless and costly push to seize Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Prigozhin's recent apparent fall from grace and influence likely reflects the real limitations on his actual power. US and UK intelligence estimated that Prigozhin has approximately 50,000 fighters in Ukraine, of whom 40,000 are convicts and 10,000 contractors. Prigozhin has been relentlessly throwing his fighters into bloody assault operations around Bakhmut at a high cost, while Putin has been conserving and training at least a portion of the men he mobilized into conventional Russian army units. Putin had never fully given in to Prigozhin's recommendations or demands throughout this transitional period and had likely always planned to put Prigozhin back into his place once the Russian conventional military improved enough to bear the burden of continuing the war. Putin had removed Lapin and appointed Surovikin, possibly on the advice of Prigozhin and his allies, but he did not grant most of Prigozhin's desires. Prigozhin is still demanding that the Kremlin officially recognize the Wagner Group in Russia, even though Russian criminal law prohibits the operation of parallel military and mercenary formations.